Good. Ready to talk about some racism. My name's Edwin. This is what I do. I study white supremacy. Particularly in my case, I study the role that fear and hatred play in the formation of gender identity within, or patterns of gender behavior within white supremacy movements. That's not going to be what this talk is tonight. This talk is focused primarily on the structures of white supremacy movements, both online and in the real world. So taking a look at how they form, how they operate, who they recruit, why they do what they do. So the bulk of this will be talking about white supremacy in the online context. Part of what makes the phenomenon of racist and supremacist organizing online so interesting is that I mean, a lot of you, if you may remember, back when the internet first was a thing, was like, you know, when it first sort of formally launched, it was sort of the futurists and the idealists of the time argued that this thing's great. This is going to revolutionize how we communicate with each other. It's going to usher in a golden age of knowledge and information sharing. And one of the very first groups that moved into the online frontier and organized were white supremacists. Groups that thrive on anonymity and sort of hiding in the shadows and doing their best to spread their message while remaining unknown themselves, found the internet to be one of the best mediums for them to do this. You don't have to divulge who you are, you don't have to divulge where you live. You can certainly write a dissertation on how much you hate non-white people, but no one ever has to know who did it. So it actually worked out really well for white supremacists. Further, the expansion of the internet and the emergence of online communities allowed for individuals who were already predisposed towards racist beliefs and racist ideologies to congregate together and to shut out the rest of the world, to form these small echo chambers online wherein they would begin to radicalize each other through socialization and these sort of group polarization processes. And what would emerge from the other end, while they may have been somewhat undirected and moderate when they came into these spaces, when they came out, you would find small groups of highly radicalized and violent individuals. So I figure we might as well just dive in. I have this thing for the first time, so yeah, I'm just going to kick the crap out of this. This is awesome. So here's my disclaimer. I just want everyone, so that we're all on the same page. The stuff that we're talking about, some of the things that you're going to hear, some of the things you're going to see are highly disturbing and can be quite emotionally triggering, especially for any individual who's been the recipient, shall we say, of eliminationist, violent rhetoric of any kind. These groups don't discriminate who they hate. They also don't stick solely in the realm of racist rhetoric. And these groups are also homophobic, transphobic. They are misogynist in the extreme. So their hate comes in bundles, and they enjoy really broadcasting it. So what are we talking about when we're talking about white supremacy? You probably can't see this. It's a little small, but white supremacy isn't a single thing. It's a soup or a sort of a melange, if you will, of a whole bunch of different things. That did not help. White supremacy is formed by a number of processes, historical processes. So these are historical, sort of historical processes or historical institutions which oppressed or marginalized other, non-white populations. And in this context, sort of the caveat we should really put on this is these terms, sort of white and black, are a little bit more fluid than you might think. Who is considered white or non-white within these groups is it's sort of it's fluid. It's based on to what extent you agree with their ideology. If you agree completely with their ideology, you're considered, pure white. If you don't, you could be considered either misguided and white or not really white at all. There's been a number of cases where researchers have gone into these communities, engaged in interviews, and when the researchers' own sort of anti-racist bias popped up, they were immediately excluded from the realm of white people and began to be described as Jewish. Didn't matter that there was no history of Jewish belief or Jewish ethnicity. All that mattered was you didn't believe these guys, and that was enough. So historical processes, economic processes, discriminatory practices in business, in job applications, in home ownership, in promotions at work. These sorts of unconscious institutions, which and sort of traditions almost, which unfairly disadvantage non-white populations. Cultural, same sort of thing, and this can go everything from the extremes of slavery to cultural stereotyping of individuals. People of Asian descent are horrible drivers, which is always my favorite thing to bring up. The stereotype is that Asian drivers, and particularly Asian women, are horrible drivers. But statistically, the worst drivers in the province of British Columbia are white men between the ages of 18 and 24. So, just throwing that out there. Jurisprudential, so this is discriminatory practices within the judicial system. In Canada, one of the starkest examples of this is actually the discrimination faced by Indigenous people, so First Nations people, who are they are sentenced to harsher prison sentences for the same crimes as, a white person gets pulled over and there's a bag of weed in their car and they get fined maybe. First Nations individual is pulled over, bag of weed in their car, they're chucked in jail. So discriminatory practices which render harsher decisions on non-white, and in the Canadian context, particularly Indigenous populations. Institutional is again part of this sort of thing, these institutional practices. The fact that in Canada, 9% of our federal MPs are non-white, and the Canadian population is 19 to 22%, depending on how you look at the statistics, non-white population. So disproportionate. They're not being represented in proportion to the actual population, which is problematic if you have a bunch of white people sitting around creating policy aimed at, for example, being more inclusive or sort of trying to endorse multicultural attitudes. It's really hard to do that if you don't have any non-white input into the process. But the big one we're talking about tonight is what I've sort of called individual. The individual white supremacist. This is sort of embodied in the person, the individual white supremacist who's a part of a white supremacist organization. I just wanted to point this out. These ideas don't come from a vacuum. This is deeply embedded within culture. Canada has, for all of its glowing reputation and all the good things Canada's done in the world, is nevertheless deeply immersed in these sorts of supremacist rhetorics. A lot of it is unchallenged. A lot of it is unseen by people who are equating white supremacy with only hate groups. They're interdependent. They rely on each other. In order for the narrative to be pushed forward, they need to be reinforced by all these different sort of intersections of power. So this is what we're talking about tonight. A specific manifestation of white supremacy, the hate group. In this case, the white supremacist organization. So what do I mean by the term hate group? Well, this. It can be defined as an organization whose purpose is to promote malice, hatred, prejudice, violence, and/or discrimination against a person or people based on their race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability or disability, national origin, or some other shared characteristic that differs from that of the dominant group. Some of these examples: Ku Klux Klan, Hammerskins, a Canadian group, Blood and Honor, Creativity Movement, which is a neo-Nazi-based white supremacist atheist religion. pun, and the Christian identity movement, which is a radicalized, extremist Christian subsect with exceptionally bizarre beliefs, also violently anti-Semitic. We can talk a little bit more about that later. Goody. So what sort of claims are we talking about when, what do white supremacists talk about? What are their sort of their myths? The dominant one is, of course, that white culture is superior. Problem, of course, is what do they mean when they're talking about white culture? For a lot of them, white culture, they simply refer to it as being European. Okay, well, is French and Bulgarian the same? What about Norwegian and Russian, or Norwegian and Italian? What are the limits of this culture? How is this culture represented? Before they can sort of, this is the number one question or the number one problem with this, their initial sort of this overarching claim is they don't even really know what they're talking about because they don't define it. It just stays with this simplistic thing. But following from that argument are these three sort of secondary tier arguments. White communities are safer. This one gets brought up all the time. It's a reference to, they argue, many of these groups do, that communities that are mostly white or all white are statistically safer than mixed communities or predominantly non-white communities. It's this idea that white communities are, everyone is good neighbors with one another. We're all on first name basis. Everyone looks out for each other and sort of watches each other's back. It's sort of an idyllic 50s style sitcom community. That's hilarious. Kelowna is 98.6% white. It's one of the whitest cities in the province. It's also one of the most violent. There's a sharp uptick in gang violence in Kelowna, and it's Hell's Angels. It's not some horrible, scary, non-white gang coming in. No, it's white people killing and shooting and beating on other white people. So this, it's a myth. It's a myth just as much as any of these other ones. White families are stronger, more caring and nurturing. So again, this sort of Mr. and Mrs. Cleaver kind of ideal picture of well, white families are strong, nuclear families that look after each other. And they juxtapose that against the myth of violent, even criminal non-white families that are dysfunctional, that deal drugs and that they're all gangsters or whatever. Again, it's a myth. It has no basis in fact at all, and yet it's one of the most recurring myths within these movements. White morality is more enlightened, which is hilarious to me as well. The idea that they all say things like, the Hammerskins will sort of say, white culture has done great things, and from white culture we've learned about liberty and justice and the rule of law, and the Magna Carta, and all these wonderful things. But they ignore things like slavery, the Holocaust, genocide beyond number, segregation. They ignore all of these other glaring examples of the failings of Western cultures. They tend to equate white with West. It's sort of how they do things. Again, these are all very sweeping generalizations about a culture that doesn't actually exist. So how does a person become a white supremacist, a dedicated white supremacist? There's actually a lot of things that are going on here. And we'll sort of see this shape pop up again a little later. A lot of what happens is first through socialization, growing up in a culture that is rife with stereotypes of non-white populations, sort of the general slangs. I don't know how many of you grew up hearing something like, I don't want to deal with that guy, he Jewed me on something. Or these sorts of stereotypes that are embedded in the culture. So young people, when they're very young, pick up a lot of this stuff from families. If your parents express deeply racist views, chances are good you're going to pick them up as well. Once you move into elementary school, once your social circle widens a little bit, if you're in a location, again, I'll use Kelowna as an example, where the chances of you running into, more than one or two members of a non-white group are very slim, chances are good you never have to actually question these beliefs. They tend to become a little more ingrained, especially if everybody else, or the majority of the other members of your peer group, tend to think the same thing. So once these things become a little more embedded, it becomes easier to believe even worse things about people. In the online context, we'll see this again. In the online context, what happens is groups will begin on general forums. I use an example, Reddit.com as a great example. A large online community that isn't explicitly racist in any way. That's its claim anyways. But it has plenty of subgroups within the broader community that espouse racist beliefs, and there's bleed through from those smaller communities into the broader community. So these ideas get a little bit of exposure. People who are already sort of predisposed to believe those sorts of things tend to gravitate towards more concentrated examples of them. So they may go from a standard internet forum to say like a forum on white rights, or sort of like a white heritage type group. And we'll take a closer look at this in a few minutes. From there, there's a process of radicalization that by immersing themselves into these sort of online echo chambers, these online communities that exclude dissenting opinion, that becomes the norm, and they start seeing those more extreme beliefs as reasonable, as normal beliefs. From there, it's not hard for some of them, not all of them, but some of them, to move into the more explicitly racist communities, leaving places like Reddit and diving into the deep end of Stormfront, which is one of the largest online white supremacy sites around. And it's big, we're talking like hundreds of thousands of members. And from there, they have access to portals to cater to all kinds of bigotry. You name it, it's on there. If there's a particular ethnic group you don't like, it's right there. And they'll, and so people will begin to gravitate to these. There was some research that was done on what's called group polarization. And part of the, sort of, just to simplify it down a lot, what was found was that in groups where people get together and discuss ideas, or discuss beliefs, or discuss options for courses of action that they should take, the common sense belief is that from that discussion, a consensus view will emerge that's a rough compromise, or a moderate position of all the inputs that have been received. What the researchers actually found was that the entire group radicalizes and moves towards the more extreme examples. This includes everything from risk-taking behavior, so the more extreme an idea, the better off it sounds to go out and try, and let's play Russian roulette, it'll be fine. To these sorts of ideas as well, that excluding the more moderate views, or drowning out the moderate views with louder, more extreme voices, tends over time to push people towards more extreme beliefs. Every single dedicated white supremacist that I came across, that I had the opportunity to discuss these things with, discussed their conversion from what they called sleepers or sheep to what they called racially aware, manifested in much the same way. This gradual exposure to more complex and extreme ideas, until what emerged in the small, the small group that came out the narrow end of the funnel, were the hardcore, dedicated white supremacists. And this is the sort of result: lynchings, extreme violence against non-white populations, murder, mayhem. I talked about the the group Christian Identity. One of their members, in sort of concert with a bunch of guys from a bunch of different white supremacist organizations, formed something they called the Order in the 1980s. The Order went on a series of armed robberies. They robbed armored cars, banks, basically any place where large amounts of money could be found. And what they were doing, they weren't doing it for themselves. What they did was they stole the money, injured or killed the guards that were there, and then funneled the money immediately into any number of other white supremacist organizations. They believed that what they were doing was funding a revolution. They were hoping that the money would be used to buy weapons and explosives to kick off a race war. They got their idea from a horrific book called The Turner Diaries. If you've ever read it, it's something. So what about examples a little closer to home? This actually came, these leaflets, this is a photocopy of a leaflet that was found in library books at the Okanagan University College campus. We figured they were put in sometime around 2001. There's still some of them popping up today. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of these things stuck at random into books. They were also stuck underneath windshield wipers, slid under doors in the dormitories, advertising for this site. It says, there's a bold new initiative being championed in the Okanagan Valley, focused specifically on educating white people pertaining to issues of concern with regard to immigration, media control, demographics, and the cultural degradation implicit within these issues. Your race needs your input and support to counter the destructive affirmative action policies designed to promote the interests of the multicultural. Literacy not always high.
That's too bad.
Designed to promote the interests of the multicultural at the expense of our proud but misguided people. Please visit our website and show your support for our tireless efforts on your behalf. Not so tireless. The website's defunct. It's owned by a Taiwanese news aggregate organization. These guys have since disappeared. We don't know where they are anymore. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Sometimes white supremacists will use a series of numbers at the ends of when they're signing off for things. 1488 is the most standard. 14 refers to those 14 words in the last sentence. 88 refers to, well, a number of things, but sometimes it's supposed to be Hitler's birthday. They'll also use SS for obvious reasons. But anyways, the 14 words is this here. That comes from a guy named David Lane, who was a member of, I believe, the Aryan Nations. He was in jail, he might be dead, I don't know. But he wrote a bunch of manifestos, and that was sort of his tagline. That was in 2008. So rally of Blood and Honor in 2009. That was a raid on Blood and Honor in 2010. The Jews are evil. That comes from Kelowna. What's not shown in that picture is on the other side of the community center are the words, the only good Jew is a dead Jew, and references to ovens. The way that this was dealt with in the community is telling of the community's feelings about the subject in general. The city of Kelowna, the city, condemned the actions and immediately called in a hate crimes task group from Vancouver to take a look at this. The public's reaction was to minimize and dismiss this as much as possible. One poster, genius, on Castanet, which is Kelowna's primary city website, it's a news site, actually argued that this was clearly the work of one person, probably a teenage boy, just having a good time, messing around and not being serious. And the reason that he gave for how he knew this, was because a swastika should be tilted on a 45-degree angle. Any real white supremacist would know that. Which of course begs the question, how did he know that? But this was standard. This was standard practice. And it wasn't just on the website. This was in discussions that you would overhear in the malls, in public, dismissing this as much as possible, rather than take a look at it and see it for what it is, which is a hate crime. They would rather instead just pretend it didn't happen. And of course, it's easy to do that in Kelowna because there's maybe only 6 or 7 families that go to the community center. The Blood and Honor meetup, that was in Calgary. The raid was subsequently in Calgary. So remember we sort of talked about or we sort of looked at the funnel earlier? Same sort of structure is implicit within the organizational structure of the movements. At the narrow end, the small end of the explicit membership, these are the paid up members, the ones that pay the bills, organize the rallies, commit the crimes, spread the hate, write the manifestos. A lot of these guys are sort of the dedicated diehards, and they don't number very many in most groups. Your standard, say, for example, your standard Southern Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, it'll have a clavern of maybe 30 guys. Maybe 5 of them are explicit. The rest of them are in the middle tier, casual members and supporters. These are the ones that they populate the forums. They talk the talk. They may or may not show up to some of the rallies, provided they can cover their faces or not identify themselves. They can't really be relied on. Sometimes they'll work a booth at like a Hammerskin concert. There's a whole subgenre of heavy metal that's Hammerskin, that's all racist all the time. The guy that shot up the Sikh temple in the US was a member of one of these bands.
Just a point of fact, they all suck.
Yeah.
It's not because they're white supremacists. They just suck.
The music's
it's really.
awful.
I've listened to a lot of it. It's bad.
It's really bad.
Really bad.
It's
boring.
Yeah, it's awful.
You're
I mean,
talking about the music, aren't you?
Yeah.
all of it. The music is terrible,
It's really
and
bad.
the lyrics are awful. It's like written by angry 10-year-olds. Anyway, the top tier of the sympathizers. These are the people that say, "Oh, I can't. I'm not associated with those Klan guys." But you know, they do have a point. Those damn dirty X, Y, or Z, whoever we hate today, they're ruining it for all of us. I don't know how, but that's the largest number. And the sympathizers, while they all interface with society, while they're all members of society, sympathizers are the broadest, sort of most diffuse end, and in sort of what guys like Bob Altmaier, who studies authoritarian movements, he refers to it as the funnel effect. The wide end of the funnel, the sympathizers, they're the ones that have, there's the most of them, so they have the most exposure. And through them, they draw people in to these sorts of ideas. And it gets filtered down. The more dedicated, the more passionate people graduate into the next level. They get filtered, messed around and radicalized. And then the extreme ones then will filter out.
Could you just, it looks to me like lots of groups could fit that pattern.
Yeah.
It looks to me
Yeah.
like humanists could fit that
Yes.
pattern. So
Tons of people do.
So what
It's pretty
differs
standard.
the white supremacist from another organization, like, I don't know, Technocracy or something? Which
I would argue that there's not a lot.
Okay.
This is common. It's common to almost every group. They're no different in that respect, and that's sort of one of the things I wanted to hammer home is the actions that a lot of these groups take are horrific. But the organization, the structure, the philosophies, the way that they organize their memberships really isn't a lot different from any other organization like this. There's nothing, I guess sort of what I'm saying is there's nothing sort of like supernaturally evil about these guys. They're douchebags that hate people who aren't like them, but they organize the same way that a lot of other groups do, because it's easy. Now, a lot of people try to mythologize it and, they're cell-like, and they could be anywhere. No, they can't, because these guys can't keep quiet. They love to talk about themselves. They love to advertise who they are. The ones that are in the cells, we're talking like a handful across a country. It's not a big thing. Most of them are in the middle row, in the casual numbers, and they're the ones that want to brag. As weird as it sounds, doing research on these guys, not as hard as you might think, because they want you to know. Because they've all got agendas, they've all got the manifesto, they've all got the truth that they need to tell you. Damn it, they will. All the time. Over and over. Horrible language. So, there's two kinds, generally, broadly speaking, there's two kinds of white supremacist, dedicated white supremacist sites on the internet. Cloaked or masked sites and explicit sites. Cloaked sites, they try to fly under the radar. They're stealth groups. And their job is primarily to bring people in, to use sort of snazzy or logical sounding or reasonable sounding rhetoric to bring people over to the cause. And through them, people will find their way to the sites we'll talk about next. So here's some of them. Council of Conservative Citizens sounds innocuous enough. It's an American group. It's a white nationalist group. Anti-immigration, wants to stop all non-white immigration. They only want immigration from Germany, Britain, and Northern Europe. But they won't tell you that explicitly. You have to read between the lines. Some of it's a little more explicit, but not all of it. MartinLutherKing.org. It's owned by a white supremacist. He refuses to sell it. He populates the site with horrible, made-up stuff about Martin Luther King. Accuses him of all sorts of terrible things. Essentially tries to paint him as history's greatest monster. It's a really, really bad dude. But because it's MartinLutherKing.org, a lot of people go to the site, and if they don't know any better, or if, a lot of this, this is the sort of the thing, is a lot of what they say is very sophisticated. But some of it has a veneer of it seems like it could be legitimate. That's one of those sites. American Third Position is just straight up white, or it's a white nationalist again. They want constitutional amendments to protect Anglo-American heritage. Because, well, black people have like a history month. How come there's no white history month? Those are their arguments, and it comes from that, Political Cesspit is a hardline conservative group. They are pseudo-libertarian, hate Mexicans. And that's like the focus of their entire, of all their radio broadcasts, which are sort of a guerrilla style broadcast. It's like an Alex Jones, but for even more.
What was the name again?
It's the Political Cesspit.
Cesspit?
Yep. Yeah, how they roll. Institute of Historical Review. Who can guess what that's about? I'll give you a. There you go. Did it like really happen, man? That's their thesis. We didn't see any ovens. It could have been for bread. That's what they talk about. Canadian Association for Free Expression. That sounds pretty awesome. Who wouldn't want to be a part of an association for free expression? Oh, right, it's free expression for white people to talk about how much they hate non-white people. They argue that whites are the most oppressed minority group in Canada. Minority group. Canada is 82% white. Just throwing that out there. Canadian Immigration Report. Sounds like a policy tank or think tank. It is not. It is a hardline, white nationalist, anti-immigration group. These are the bastards that took pictures of me, stuck it on their website along with my home address where I work. Just in case, because, maybe I'll sign something for them if they show up. But, again, these are Occidental Observer is cloaked anti-Semitism. These things are. These are the sort of the blunt edge. These are the ones that appear to have a veneer of plausibility. How do people get from there to the more explicit sites? Well, we already saw this. That's one of the halfway points. Is getting into those sites, absorbing that sort of attitude, and from there, they move into the explicit sites. Explicit sites are these ones: Blood and Honor, Stormfront, WhiteHonor.com. Creativity Alliance, and Kingdom Identity Ministries. There's more. This is just, handy. Blood and Honor is neo-Nazi, primarily, although there's some are neo-pagan and there's other sorts of things. Yeah, there's a movement called Asatru, and Asatru is the worship of the Norse gods. And there's a fracture within the movement. Half of the movement are ecumenical. They're also very inclusive. Their argument is, if the gods have called to you, it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter where you're from, the gods have called to you and you come. And they're cool with whoever. The other side are hardline nationalists. They believe in the purity of Norse blood. If you are not Northern European, and maybe German, and maybe British, you're not in. You're French, you're Gallic, get out. And they're very, very, the fights between the two of them are epic. It's good comedy. Stormfront is a clearinghouse. It's a clearinghouse for everything. It doesn't matter if you're a Klansman or a Nazi or a Hammerskin, doesn't matter if you're a Christian identity, although if you're a Klansman and you're Christian, you're probably an identity believer. You'll find someone or something for you on Stormfront. A lot of Canadian groups go into the Stormfront Canada subgroup, and that's where they organize, find out where each other live, and find out, what's the whitest place in Canada, and how to move there. Whitehonor.com is exactly what it says. It's neo-Nazi again. Creativity Alliance is awesome, and by awesome I just mean tragically hilarious. Imagine, if you will, a bunch of 13-year-olds who hate Jews, and they decide they also hate God. They want to create their own religion. So what they do is they find this guy, Ben Clausen, who's like an old school anti-Semite, and a worshiper of Hitler. He actually believed Hitler was like the coolest guy. What he does, and what the group subsequently does, is they renounce all supernatural claims. There are no spooks or fairies or whatever they call it, no gods, no devils, no demons, nothing. The only concept worthy of worship is white blood, is the blood of white people. These guys are something of a running joke within the white supremacy movement. Nobody else takes them seriously. They have edicts within their group saying things like, boys, you will dress like cowboys. Western fashion is what you will wear. Women, you will dress modestly and you will keep your hair long because it's prettier that way. This one guy, Michael Barkoon, he described the creativity movement, the creativity religion in general, as virulent anti-racism coupled with histrionic conspiracy theories and health food faddism. You're also supposed to eat raw, organically grown vegetables and nothing else.
Did you say anti-racism?
I'm sorry?
You said anti-racism.
Oh, sorry.
You meant the opposite of that.
Yeah, I meant the opposite of that. These guys
right.
hate, the primary focus of their hatred, take care of the primary focus is anti-Semitism. For them, they believe that the Jewish religion, the Jewish people have orchestrated a massive conspiracy of global proportions. They dominate every single white nation on the planet, and they are secretly preparing for the day that the United Nations will declare war on America and send in their black shock troops to steal your guns and rape your women. That is the mythology of the Creativity Alliance. Oh, also, their number one real-world enemy who they actually fight with is the creativity movement. Another faction, and they hate each other more than they hate anybody else. If you look at the arrests of their top guys, more often than not, they're arrested for fighting each other. It's a weird thing, and it's sort of hard to grasp. But groups that build their organizations around hate tend not to get along well with other people. Kingdom Identity Ministries is a clearinghouse for the Christian identity movement. The Christian identity movement is a Christian religion that believes that white people and non-white people are all aliens. And the white people bred with other aliens who are angels, and then picked a fight with the non-white aliens in the middle of the galaxy, and they all fought each other, and then they all came to Earth and crash landed, and the different nations, they joined together according to the insignia on their starships, and then they fought one another. Or they believe that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, that Adam and Eve and Abel and Cain are all real people, that Abel was the good son, Cain, bad son. Cain kills Abel, gets expelled from Eden, dwells to the east in the land of Nod, where he finds a race of non-human primates. they refer to any non-white group as mud people. He bred with them and created a race. The race became known as the Jewish race. Cain himself isn't the child of Adam. Cain is the result of a sexual congress between Eve and the snake. That's the more toned down version of their faith. They are massively violent. They create groups such as Elohim City, which is a heavily armed, mined compound in Missouri. They number about 20 to 25,000 across the United States. Most of them in tiny little.
Just throw it at somebody.
I can't. I have to play with things. It's how I do things. I'm sorry. They maintain these compounds, these paramilitary compounds, and part of what they do is they don't just raise their children within the faith. They raise their children as troops. So as soon as boys, and only boys, are old enough to hold a firearm, they begin training them. They're homeschooled. They are as isolated geographically as they can be. They are absolutely convinced that the end is coming and that Armageddon will come in the form of a race war, which will, sorry.
Is this the Kingdom Identity group you're talking about?
Kingdom Identity Ministries. Kingdom Identity Ministries is just one of them. It's one of the larger clearinghouses of identity thought. Most of the sermons from Christian Identity are actually recorded as podcasts and then uploaded every week. They also have a number of AM radio stations that will broadcast their message. And we're not talking like identity-owned stations. We're talking like clear channel, sort of like actually, public access or privately owned that sort of agree with the message of it.
Isn't any regulatory bodies trying to shut down hate speech?
Hey, look, it's not hate speech, it's freedom of speech. First Amendment rights in the U.S. look a little bit different. Provided that they don't actually say, go out and kill X, Y, and Z, they can say whatever they want.
What about identity? I read stuff a few years ago. There was one of the core beliefs was that the 10 lost tribes of Israel were actually the northern race, and they were the true Jewish.
Yeah, one of the core beliefs is that they are the true Israel people, or they think of themselves as the true Jews.
Covenant people.
Yeah, and they argue that some groups, depending on sort of how they articulate their position, some groups will argue that one of the tribes of Israel buggered off to England. And by the way, Jesus was probably British. It emerges out of what's called a British Israel movement. And the British Israelist movement was, oddly enough, philo-Semitic, which means that they had a high degree of respect for the Jewish culture. They wanted to be a part of it. It's only once it migrated across the pond to the United States and then into Canada that it radicalized. And fun story, true story, both the creativity movement and the modern, what we now call the Christian identity movement, have their roots in Canada. Ben Klassen was a Canadian. He penned his white man's Bible while he was still living in Saskatchewan. The Christian identity movement radicalized, became exceptionally anti-Semitic, virulently racist in Vancouver and Nelson. Yeah, historical accuracy is good for these guys only insofar as it supports their message. If it moves against them, they'll make stuff up. Why not? They don't care. The most important thing to them, and I often refer to them as guys, it's because the majority of these groups are men, dominated by men, organized by men. In kingdom identity, in the Christian identity movement particularly, women are considered not just subservient to men, but lesser than men. And in some of the more isolated groups, there are active debates about the benefits of polygamy, and they refer to women as though women were fields to be plowed and managed, including they use the term lying fallow. So this little slide is what I like to call, what can we do? Well, the first is to become educated. And that means not just educated about what these folks believe, how they argue, what their rhetoric is, what their strategies are, all the ways that they use to entice people to join them, learning their tactics, practice self-reflection. It's really, really, really easy to point out the failings of others. It's really easy to point out the shortcomings of others. It's really easy to point out when other people are being racist or bigoted or misogynist. It is not as easy to find it in yourself. And that's especially true if, like the majority of the people in this room, happen to occupy the highest echelons of the social order.
Yeah.
As white men and women, we're not really sitting at a point where we have to worry too much about marginalization or oppression. And that level of privilege gives us an opportunity to be rather blind to some of the more subtle forms of marginalization, of racism. This one, I think, is probably more important than any other one. And it's also the hardest. Especially growing up in a culture that's embedded with, it's deeply embedded with these sorts of supremacist ideas. Be skeptical. I'm a skeptic. I'm part of the skeptic movement. I have to tie it into the talk. It's important. Many forms of the more subtle kinds of racism can actually seem like plausible arguments. Well, obviously there's more black people in jail in the US that commit more crimes. Well, it's an abuse of statistics. If you take a closer look, if you do some research, you find there's all sorts of reasons for those statistics, and they don't actually indicate what people say they do. Within the skeptical community, within the atheist communities, there's been something of a debate going on for the last, couple of years. And it centers around the argument, do social justice and social advocacy issues have anything to do with skepticism? Yeah, obviously, they do. If they have to. These sorts of beliefs, these sorts of ideologies, and these are the most obvious ones. The ones that I've been talking about tonight are the most obvious. These are absolutely fair game for skeptics, for atheists, for any critical thinkers, really, to look at and to examine. Just because it might seem a little more difficult than debunking homeopathy doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Become intolerant of intolerance. I can't stand the idea that I have to be tolerant of all ideas. I despise racist ideas. I have zero tolerance for racist ideas. I have no reason, and I have no inclination to listen to them. And if I hear them being spouted in the public sphere, I'll say something about it. I have every right to. Just because you have the right to say hateful stuff doesn't mean I have to be quiet. So I'll say things about it. And the last two, confront it and resist it. Confronting is pretty simple. Anti-racist groups are awesome. There needs to be more of them, and the work they do needs to be recognized. Going out into the streets when there is a white pride march and standing up to them and saying that you're not going to tolerate it. Or my personal favorite tactic, have signs that say for every single white supremacist or skinhead that shows up that wants to proclaim their racism, you'll make, or your group will make a $20 donation to the local multicultural center or the local Sikh temple or the local whatever. They're there to spread a message. Turn it against them. Use it for something more positive. It works well with the Westboro Baptist Church. They'll show up to do their little pickets and spread their hate, and other groups will stand across the street with a table and a donation jar, and they'll donate to the local pride community or whichever charity they've chosen for that day. And resist sort of goes hand in hand with that. Allowing this stuff to go unchallenged, to try to ignore racist speech, doesn't do anything. There has never been an example of ignoring racist speech that has done anything ever anywhere. It doesn't work. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It's the functional equivalent of condoning it. If someone's telling racist jokes, if someone is marching in the streets and you just stand by and don't do anything, to someone who is being targeted by these groups, they can't see inside your mind. They have no idea whether you support them or the racists. And it might not make them feel very good. It might not make them feel very welcome or feel like they have anyone on their side. So vocalize it. Stand up to them. I mean, these guys, for the most part, are cowards. in the face of superior numbers or in the face of a dedicated opposition, they run away. What happened to the last one in Calgary where they all marched down the street and, oh, we're awesome, all 12 of us, wow. And then people showed up and what did they do? They ran into the subways and waited for the cops to escort them home. That's the modern white supremacy.
And that's it.